At the beginning of June 1942, a naval battle took place in the waters of the central part of the Pacific Ocean near the Midway Atoll, which was later recognized by many military historians as one of the most significant turning points of the entire Second World War in the Pacific theater of operations, a battle, the outcome of which was largely determined by the actions of carrier-based aircraft, and not by the traditional artillery confrontation of surface ships, which in itself at that time was a relatively new, not yet fully established concept of naval warfare. By the time of this battle, the Japanese Imperial Navy had a significant quantitative and, in many ways, qualitative superiority over the opposing American naval forces, including a significantly larger number of aircraft carriers involved and, in general, a very high level of training of Japanese deck pilots, who by that time had significant practical combat experience from several previous years of active combat operations. However, the combination of several very significant factors, including the timely acquisition by the American side through the successful breaking of Japanese naval codes of critical intelligence information about the planned Japanese attack on Midway Atoll, as well as a certain amount of luck and a successful combination of tactical circumstances directly during the battle itself, led to a result that turned out to be completely opposite to the initial expectations of the Japanese command. The culminating, in many ways decisive episode of the entire battle was a relatively short in its actual duration, but at the same time extremely effective episode, which went down in military history under the informal name The Wonderful 4 Minutes, and almost simultaneous, very successfully coordinated in time, although not the result of an initial single tactical plan, attack of several squadrons of American carrier-based dive bombers directly on Japanese aircraft carriers at the very critical moment when the flight decks these Japanese ships were literally overwhelmed by a significant number of their own aircraft, refueled and rearmed immediately before the expected re-attack on American forces, which made the Japanese aircraft carriers at this particular point in time extremely vulnerable to such a surprise attack. As a result of this very effective attack, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers involved in the battle received such serious damage within literally a matter of minutes that they were subsequently either sunk directly during the ongoing battle, or were forced to be deliberately scuttled by their own crew due to the impossibility of effectively extinguishing large-scale fires that arose on board, posing a critical threat to the very existence of the ships. The loss of a significant part of the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet, which included a significant number of extremely experienced, well-trained pilots and ground technical personnel, whose professional qualifications turned out to be objectively impossible to quickly replace during the remaining period of the military conflict, had a colossal, largely irreversible strategic impact on the entire further course of military operations in the Pacific theater, actually depriving the Japanese Imperial Navy of such previously significant quantitative and qualitative superiority in the field of carrier-based aviation, which provided the Japanese side with the initiative throughout the previous period of active hostilities. The Battle of Midway remains one of the most striking historical examples of how decisive, often disproportionately significant relative to its immediate duration, the actions of carrier-based aircraft can have on the overall outcome of a major naval battle and, in certain cases, on the entire further strategic course of an entire military conflict, clearly demonstrating already at a fairly early historical stage in the formation of naval aviation the fundamentally new role that carrier-based aircraft were subsequently called upon to play in naval warfare throughout the subsequent decades. Among the many high-tech, expensive solutions in the field of aerial surveillance, there is at first glance a surprisingly simple, but at the same time very effective technical solution, the tethered balloon of the JLEN system, Joint Land Attack Cruise Missile Defense Elevated Netted Sensor System, which is, in fact, a large, helium-filled inflatable device, raised to a considerable height and held in place by means of a durable, specially reinforced cable connecting it to a ground station. The fundamental idea underlying such a seemingly technologically simple concept is the exceptionally high practical value of long-term, continuous presence of radar or other sensor equipment at a significant altitude without the need for an expensive conventional manned or even unmanned aircraft that requires constant maintenance and regular crew changes. Unlike any aircraft that must regularly return to base for refueling, scheduled maintenance, or crew changes, a tethered balloon is capable of remaining at a given operating altitude for many days, and under certain favorable operating conditions, several weeks of continuous duty, providing exceptionally long, almost continuous radar surveillance of a certain area without the regular interruptions in observation typical of any aircraft due to the need to replace one on duty in the aircraft. To others, the significant altitude of such a balloon, often exceeding several thousand meters, provides an exceptionally wide radius of effective radar coverage, which is especially valuable for detecting potentially dangerous low-flying targets, cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, or low-flying manned aircraft, which, as we have already discussed in detail earlier in the context of a general conversation about the effect of following the terrain, are often able to effectively avoid timely detection by significantly less high-lying ground-based radars stations precisely due to the natural curvature of the Earth's surface and the characteristics of the specific terrain. Technically, such a system includes not only the balloon itself with radar or other sensor equipment installed on it, but also a fairly complex ground infrastructure, a durable, specially designed mooring station that ensures reliable holding of the balloon in place under a wide variety of, sometimes very unfavorable meteorological conditions, as well as the necessary equipment for transmitting intelligence data collected by the balloon to ground operators in real time via a special cable integrated directly into the design rope holding the balloon. A significant practical limitation of such a system is the objectively very low mobility of the balloon itself, effectively tied to a specific, fixed ground-based base point, which makes such a system optimal primarily for long-term, stationary observation of a specific, predetermined and relatively unchanging area in time, for example, to protect a large stationary military facility or a significant section of the state border, but much less applicable for flexible, operational monitoring of a dynamically changing situation at a considerable distance from the stationary location basing of the balloon itself. An additional significant practical limitation is the obvious vulnerability of such a relatively slow, large-sized and, importantly, tied to a fixed-point balloon to a possible direct attack from a technically advanced enemy, which significantly limits the practical feasibility of using such a system primarily in situations of a relatively limited direct military threat, and not in a full-scale, high-intensity armed conflict against a technically advanced enemy capable of effectively destroying such a very noticeable and physically vulnerable stationary target. We have already examined in detail numerous aspects of the operation of the flight deck of an aircraft carrier itself. But a significant, often most part of the aircraft carrier-based aircraft at certain periods of time is not located on the flight deck itself, but deep inside the ship's hull, on a special hangar deck, from where aircraft are periodically lifted up to the flight deck using a special system of powerful cargo lifts, aircraft lifts. The hangar deck, located directly below the flight deck, is a large, enclosed interior space of significant area, used primarily for more serious, long-term maintenance and repair of aircraft, for which, in contrast to the relatively quick, operational maintenance directly on the flight deck between individual combat missions, it requires much more time and, importantly, conditions for such technical work that are much more protected from adverse weather conditions of the open sea. The movement of aircraft between the relatively cramped hangar deck and the open flight deck is provided by several powerful aircraft lifts, located, as a rule, along the sides of the ship, outside the immediate central, most intensively used part of the flight deck, which allows such movement of aircraft without significant disruption to the simultaneously ongoing intensive flight operations in the central part of the flight deck. Each such aircraft lift is a fairly large, technically very reliable platform, capable of lifting a significant weight of a fully equipped combat aircraft, along with a certain volume of accompanying technical personnel and the necessary equipment, between the hangar and flight deck levels in a relatively short period of time, which is critical to maintaining the necessary high tempo of intensive flight operations characteristic of modern combat use of an aircraft carrier. A significant additional technical requirement for the design of such aircraft lifts is their reliable performance in a wide variety of, sometimes very unfavorable weather conditions of the open sea, including significant rolling of the ship and strong waves, as well as ensuring sufficient structural strength and reliability of such a system even in conditions of possible combat damage to the ship, since the failure of a significant part of such aircraft lifts can critically limit the real combatability of an aircraft carrier for intensive flight operations. Even while maintaining full functionality of the flight deck itself. A separate, no less important logistical task is the movement of the aircraft weapons themselves between special protected ammunition storage facilities located in the most protected, deepest part of the ship's hull, and the flight deck, where these weapons are directly suspended on aircraft preparing for a combat mission. This task is solved by means of a separate, specialized system of ammunition cargo lifts, structurally and organizationally separated from the already mentioned aircraft lifts precisely for reasons of additional safety, minimizing the risk of accidental simultaneous damage to both the aircraft itself and the military weapons stored on board in the event of a possible emergency within the framework of one of these two parallel, but physically separated internal logistics systems of the ship. The coordinated, effective operation of the entire complex internal logistics system of an aircraft carrier, combining the hangar deck, aircraft lifts, ammunition storage and delivery system, remains a critically important, although completely hidden from the outside observer, element of ensuring the overall high intensity of combat flight operations of a modern aircraft carrier, clearly demonstrating that the real combat effectiveness of such a ship is determined not only by the externally visible work of the flight deck itself, but also by a much less noticeable, but absolutely necessary, coordinated the work of the ship's extensive, complexly organized internal infrastructure. We have already repeatedly mentioned various aspects of medical support for military aviation, including the work of aviation doctors already discussed in detail earlier. But there is also a separate, very specialized branch of military aviation, whose direct task is directly to quickly, as safely as possible, transport wounded and sick military personnel from the theater of military operations to places where the necessary qualified medical care is provided: air ambulance, aeromedical evacuation, aeromedical evacuation. The historical development of this area of military medicine is most directly related to the consistent increase in the overall speed and reliability of military transport aviation throughout the 20th century, since it is the significant reduction in the total time of transportation of a seriously wounded soldier from the place of immediate injury to the place of providing full, qualified surgical care that is one of the key factors that most significantly determines the real chances of such a wounded person for successful survival and subsequent recovery. Statistical data accumulated over several successive major military conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries convincingly demonstrate a steady, very significant reduction in the overall mortality rate among wounded military personnel, largely directly due to the consistent reduction in the average time for evacuation of a wounded person from the site of injury to full surgical care, which was largely facilitated by the consistent development and increasingly widespread practical use of various means of air ambulances during this historical period. The modern aeromedical evacuation system includes several sequential, interconnected levels. Directly from the battlefield, the evacuation of the wounded is usually carried out by means of relatively small, maneuverable helicopters capable of landing in close proximity to the battlefield, providing the fastest possible initial transportation of the wounded to the nearest point of emergency medical care, where the wounded receives initial stabilization of his condition before he is suitable for further, often much longer, transportation. For subsequent evacuation over much longer distances, for example, From a theater of military operations to a large, fully equipped military hospital, located at a significant distance from the immediate combat zone, and sometimes on another continent, much larger, specially equipped military transport aircraft are used, the internal space of which is equipped with special medical equipment for the duration of such a mission, including places for placing stretchers with the wounded, the necessary equipment for maintaining vital functions and monitoring the condition of the most critical patients directly during the flight, as well as the presence on board of specially trained medical personnel capable of providing the necessary emergency medical care directly during transportation. A significant modern technological achievement in this area has been the creation and practical implementation of specialized mobile surgical teams and associated portable medical equipment that can effectively function directly on board a transport aircraft in flight, which in certain, most critical cases allows certain emergency surgical interventions to be carried out directly in the air, even before the aircraft actually arrives at its destination, further increasing the real chances of the most seriously injured patients for successful survival during prolonged transportation. The development of such a complex, multi-level aeromedical evacuation system over the past several decades remains one of the most visible, practically measurable examples of how the consistent technological development of military aviation can have the most immediate, often vitally significant positive impact far beyond the exclusively combat use of aircraft, directly contributing to the preservation of the lives of military personnel injured directly during the performance of combat missions. In the summer of 1948, shortly after the end of World War II, military transport aviation found itself at the center of one of the most significant humanitarian operations in its entire history, the famous Berlin Air Bridge, during which the Western Allies for almost a year provided almost all the necessary supplies to the inhabitants of the western sectors of Berlin exclusively through air transport, in conditions of a complete land blockade of the city by the Soviet occupation forces. The strategic background of this situation was that West Berlin, being territorially deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of post-war Germany, was almost completely cut off from direct land communication with the rest of the territory controlled by the Western Allies, due to the land blockade imposed by the Soviet side, which presented the Western occupation authorities with a very difficult choice: either to agree to the actual capitulation of the western sectors of Berlin under pressure from such blockade, or to undertake an attempt on an unprecedented scale to ensure the full supply of a multi-million urban population exclusively through air transport. The scale of such a task turned out to be truly colossal. To ensure at least the minimum required level of supply of food, fuel, and other vital goods to the population of the western sectors of Berlin, it was necessary to transport by air many thousands of tons of various cargo daily, which initially significantly exceeded the real practical capabilities of the military transport aviation available at that time to the Western Allies. The organization of such an unprecedented air operation required exceptionally precise, detailed logistics coordination, including an almost continuous, round-the-clock flow of transport aircraft following strictly defined air corridors with an interval of just minutes between successive flights, which in itself posed a significant challenge from the point of view of the safe management of such intense air traffic using navigation and dispatch technologies of that historical period, which were relatively imperfect by modern standards. A significant part of the transported goods consisted of stone fuel, used for heating and power supply to the city, as well as a variety of food necessary to ensure a minimum acceptable standard of living for the urban population throughout the entire period of the blockade, while a certain part of the transported goods included quite unexpected, but at the same time very symbolically significant categories of goods, including, in particular, regular supplies of sweets for the children's population of the city, which later became a well-known symbol of the most humane side of this large-scale military logistics operation. After almost a year of intensive, almost continuous air transport, the Soviet side, faced with the obvious practical ineffectiveness of the initially introduced land blockade, which was unable to break the resolve of the Western Allies and the will of the population of West Berlin itself, was forced to officially lift this blockade, which de facto marked the complete success of the entire large-scale air supply operation. The Berlin airlift remains one of the most striking historical examples of the practical use of military transport aviation for purely humanitarian, rather than directly combat purposes, clearly demonstrating both the real practical potential of strategic military transport aviation and the very significant political and symbolic significance that such a large-scale humanitarian air operation can acquire in the context of a broader geopolitical confrontation between competing parties in the conditions of the then emerging Cold War. We have already repeatedly mentioned various aspects of the use of parachutes in military aviation, from emergency ejection of a pilot to the landing of personnel and cargo. But the very shape and design of the military parachute canopy has undergone significant technological evolution throughout the history of military aviation, significantly increasing both the safety and practical accuracy of landing of personnel and cargo dropped by parachute. The earliest, historically the first and for many decades the dominant form of a military parachute was a relatively simple round dome in its basic geometry, which physically represented a large piece of special parachute fabric, tailored in a shape close to a hemisphere, which provided the necessary aerodynamic drag, which significantly slowed down the rate of descent of the landing person or cargo to a relatively safe level. A significant fundamental limitation of such a classical, round design of a parachute was the very limited real controllability of such a dome during the descent process. A person landing through such a parachute had an extremely limited practical opportunity to actually influence the direction and speed of his own horizontal movement directly during the descent process, which made the final point of the actual landing to a very significant extent dependent on the direction and strength of the actual wind at various heights during the descent process, in many ways similar to the previously discussed in detail problem of accuracy traditional, uncontrolled cargo landing. A significant technological breakthrough was the subsequent appearance and gradual increasingly widespread practical implementation of a fundamentally different design of a parachute canopy, the so-called parachute wing, ram air parachute, which is not a simple hemispherical canopy, but a much more complex structure in its internal geometry, consisting of several separate, interconnected airtight section cells, which during the descent are filled with the oncoming flow air, ultimately forming a fairly rigid, aerodynamically efficient surface, in many ways reminiscent in its principle of operation of a conventional aircraft wing, although much less rigid in its physical design. Such a fundamentally new design of a parachute canopy provides an incomparably higher degree of real controllability during the descent process compared to a traditional, simple round canopy. The landing person, through appropriate control of the tension of certain lines of such a parachute wing, gets the opportunity to quite effectively control both the speed and, most importantly, the direction of his own horizontal movement during the descent process, which significantly increases the practical accuracy of landing precisely at a pre-planned, desired landing point, outside depending on certain unfavorable wind conditions characteristic of the specific circumstances of this particular landing. Such significantly increased controllability of the wing parachute has become one of the key technical factors that made the previously discussed in detail high-altitude covert landing technique practically feasible, used, in particular, by combat controllers and the Parachute Rescue Service, since it is the significant controllability of such a modern wing parachute that allows the landing specialist to overcome a very significant horizontal distance in the process of a long, controlled descent from a high altitude, effectively reaching in advance a planned landing point that is significantly distant horizontally from the initial point of leaving the aircraft at high altitude. Modern military aviation, however, continues to use both fundamental types of parachute systems depending on the specific practical task. The much simpler, more reliable and, importantly, significantly less expensive traditional round canopy remains the optimal solution for relatively mass landing of personnel that does not require exceptionally high precision of individual landing, while the much more technically complex and expensive wing parachute is used mainly in situations requiring exceptionally high individual precision of the controlled landings characteristic of the activities of highly specialized special-purpose units. We have already repeatedly mentioned the technique of high-altitude covert landing in the context of the activities of various specialized military units. But the specific physics and technology of such a landing, which includes two fundamentally different techniques, HALO, high-altitude low opening, and HAHO, high-altitude high opening, deserves a separate, more detailed technical consideration. Both such techniques are united by a common, fundamental principle: the landing specialist leaves the carrier aircraft at a very significant altitude, often exceeding 7,000 to 8,000 meters, which is significantly higher than the altitude at which the carrier aircraft could be quite easily visually or radar detected by enemy ground means, which allows the carrier aircraft to carry out the landing operation, remaining at a considerable distance and at a very significant altitude relative to potentially dangerous enemy territory, thereby significantly reducing the risk both for the aircraft itself and, importantly, for a specific, not previously unmasked point of the specialist's intended landing. The fundamental difference between these two methods lies directly in the moment of actual deployment of the parachute used relative to the entire period of descent of the landing specialist from the moment of leaving the plane until the moment of actual landing on the ground. When using the HALO technique, the landing specialist makes a fairly long free fall throughout almost the entire descent, opening his own parachute only at a relatively small, safe height immediately before landing, which significantly minimizes the total time during which the landing specialist is under an already fully opened, much more noticeable and, importantly, much slower descending parachute canopy, potentially detectable visually or even through certain technical means of enemy surveillance at a relatively significant distance. The HAHO technique, on the contrary, involves the opening of a parachute by a landing specialist almost immediately after directly leaving the carrier aircraft, that is, at the same very significant initial altitude, but at the same time, the landing specialist, using the significant controllability of a modern wing parachute that has already been discussed in detail, makes a fairly long, fully controlled gliding flight under an already open canopy over a very significant horizontal distance, often reaching several tens of kilometers, before then reaching a specific, pre-planned point of actual landing. The choice of a specific technique is largely determined by the specific requirements of a particular combat mission. The HALO technique, which provides a minimum time of visual visibility under an open canopy, is optimal primarily for landing directly in relative proximity to a specific target point, while the much more technically complex HAHO technique, which requires a significantly longer, physically exhausting controlled gliding flight under the canopy, often in conditions of very low ambient temperatures at high altitudes, is optimal precisely in situations that require landing at a very significant horizontal distance from the point of immediate departure of the aircraft, which allows the carrier aircraft to remain at a significantly greater distance from a specific target landing point, further increasing the overall secrecy and safety of the entire operation. Both such techniques require from the landing specialist exceptionally long, thorough specialized training, including mandatory mastery of high-altitude breathing techniques using additional oxygen, the need for which we have already discussed in detail in the context of a general conversation about the physiology of high-altitude flights, as well as exceptional physical and psychological endurance necessary to effectively perform a very long, physically demanding descent in the extreme conditions of high altitude, significant cold and, often, complete darkness, characteristic of the real practical application of such very technically complex and physically demanding covert landing techniques. We have already examined in detail how military aviation avoids dangerous meteorological phenomena such as thunderstorms, But there is also a fundamentally different, much more permanent, sustainable climate challenge that military aviation is forced to face precisely in certain geographic regions on a regular, systematic basis: extremely low temperatures characteristic of the Arctic and subarctic regions, creating a number of very specific technical difficulties that differ significantly from the much more familiar operating conditions of aircraft in a temperate or warm climate. The first significant difficulty is directly related to the operation of the aircraft engine itself in conditions of extremely low ambient temperatures. Aviation fuel at certain, very low negative temperatures can begin to crystallize or, at least, significantly increase its own viscosity, which can seriously hamper the normal operation of the engine fuel system, including both the fuel supply process and its subsequent effective atomization by injectors, necessary for the normal, efficient process of fuel combustion in the engine combustion chamber. That is why aviation fuel used by military aircraft operating in such extremely cold climatic conditions often contains special additives that significantly lower the crystallization temperature of the fuel itself, thereby ensuring its normal, reliable performance even at significantly lower temperatures compared to standard aviation fuel used in more moderate climatic conditions. A significant additional complexity is created by the overall performance of various hydraulic systems of the aircraft in conditions of extreme cold. Standard hydraulic fluid, with a significant decrease in temperature, can significantly increase its own viscosity, which can seriously hamper the normal, effective operation of various hydraulically controlled systems of the aircraft, including, in particular, the previously disassembled control surfaces in detail and, what is especially critical, the system for retracting and extending the landing gear, which is necessary precisely at critical moments of takeoff and landing airplane. Icing of the airframe itself is also a significant practical problem. The formation of a layer of ice on the outer surfaces, primarily on the leading edge of the wing and tail, which can seriously disrupt the normal aerodynamic characteristics of the aircraft, significantly reducing the lift force created by the wing and at the same time significantly increasing the overall aerodynamic drag, which, with a significant intensity of such icing, can create a very serious, potentially catastrophic threat to flight safety. That is why military aircraft regularly operated in such extremely cold climatic conditions are equipped with special anti-icing systems that use, depending on the specific technical implementation, either electrical heating of the most critical airframe surfaces susceptible to icing, or a special pneumatic system that periodically mechanically destroys the already formed layer of ice through the controlled inflation of special rubber elements built directly into the structure of the leading edge of the wing. In conditions of extreme cold, the physiological training of the flight and ground technical personnel themselves, who have to perform their professional duties in conditions of extremely low ambient temperatures, also acquires significant additional importance, which requires the use of special, very technically advanced protective clothing, as well as certain specialized training aimed at the timely recognition and effective prevention of various forms of cold injuries, including frostbite, which represents a very real practical threat to personnel forced to perform fairly long technical operations directly on the ground, outdoors in these extremely cold climates. The combination of all such very specific technical and physiological challenges makes the operation of military aviation in extreme Arctic or subarctic climates a separate, very specialized area of military aviation practice, requiring significant additional specialized technical and physiological training of both the aircraft itself and the directly involved flight and technical personnel compared to the much more common, standard practice of operating military aviation in significantly more moderate climatic conditions. We have already examined in detail the informal cultural tradition of squadron emblems and personal call signs for pilots. But there is also a completely separate, much more official, formalized category of recognition of the merits of a military aviation unit, collective gratitude and awards of the unit citations, assigned not to an individual, specific serviceman, but to the entire unit as a whole, In recognition of the exceptional collective military merits of this particular unit within the framework of a certain, specific military operation or a long period of active combat operations. The fundamental difference between such a collective award and the much more familiar individual awards and insignia of individual military personnel is that the right to wear a certain special insignia awarded by such a collective award extends to all military personnel who were officially included in the specific awarded unit at the time of the relevant exceptional military merits, regardless of the individual personal contribution of each specific serviceman in achieving such a collective result. The assignment of such a collective award, as a rule, requires official documentary evidence of exceptional, significantly exceeding the usual expected standards of combat merit of the entire unit as a whole. For example, the successful completion of an exceptionally complex combat operation involving significant risk, demonstration of exceptional collective courage and professionalism of personnel in the face of serious, significant opposition from the enemy, or the achievement of significant, strategically significant combat results made possible precisely thanks to the well-coordinated, coordinated collective actions of all personnel of this particular department. Military personnel serving as part of a unit awarded such an official collective award traditionally receive the right to permanently wear the corresponding special insignia directly on their military uniform, which often remains even in the event of a subsequent transfer of a particular serviceman to another unit, which makes such an insignia a kind of permanent, officially recognized evidence of the personal participation of a particular serviceman in historically significant, officially recognized as exceptional collective military merits of a particular unit in a certain, specific period of his own military service. In addition to the purely formal, official recognition of such collective merits, the assignment of such a collective award traditionally acquires a very significant symbolic, psychological significance directly for the personnel of the awarded unit, serving as a subject of well-founded collective professional pride and, importantly, a significant element of the preserved historical memory and continuity of a particular military unit, often passed on to subsequent generations of military personnel serving in the same unit much later, after the immediate completion of the service of specific military personnel, whose collective military merits were originally deserved such an official award. Such a tradition of collective recognition of the military merits of the military unit as a whole, along with other elements of the specific military aviation professional culture already discussed in detail earlier, clearly demonstrates the significant importance that the military aviation tradition attaches not only to the individual merits of individual, specific military personnel, but also to a much broader, collective aspect of the professional identity and historical continuity of a specific military aviation unit as a relatively independent organizational unit with its own, very long historical tradition. We have already examined in detail the various threats to which traditional radio communications between military aircraft are exposed, including the various forms of electronic jamming and interception that have already been discussed in detail. But modern military aviation is increasingly actively researching and practically implementing a fundamentally alternative secure communication technology, much less vulnerable to such traditional threats: optical, laser communication between aircraft. The fundamental technical difference between such optical communication and the much more traditional, widely used radio communication lies in the very physical nature of the signal used to transmit information. Instead of traditional radio waves propagating in a wide beam in almost all directions from the radiation source, which makes such a radio signal potentially detectable and, accordingly, intercepted by any technically equipped receiver that happens to be within the propagation zone of this radio signal, optical communication uses exclusively a narrowly directed, focused laser beam that transmits the necessary information directly between a specific transmitter and a specific receiver, physically located exactly along the propagation path of a given narrow laser beam. This fundamental feature of optical communication creates a very significant practical advantage in terms of the overall secrecy and security of the transmitted information, since the transmitted laser signal itself does not physically propagate away from a precisely defined, very narrow direction between a specific transmitter and a specific receiver. To effectively intercept such information, a potential adversary would need to physically place their own receiving device exactly along the path of propagation of this extremely narrowly directed laser beam, which is a much more technically complex task compared to with much easier interception of a traditional, much more widely distributed radio signal. Likewise, optical communication turns out to be fundamentally much less vulnerable to the previously discussed methods of traditional electronic suppression, since such methods, as a rule, are effective against a relatively broadband radio signal propagating in a wide range of directions, while effective suppression of a narrowly directed laser beam would require the enemy to have precise knowledge of the specific, very limited direction of propagation of this signal, which essentially, sometimes almost completely excludes the very fundamental possibility of effective, practical suppression of such communication through traditional electronic countermeasures methods. A significant technical limitation of optical laser communication, however, remains the objective need to ensure sufficiently accurate, stable mutual pointing of the transmitter and receiver at each other throughout the entire period of maintaining communication, which represents a much more technically complex task in relation to communication between two moving aircraft, often with a very significant relative speed, compared to significantly less demanding traditional radio communications in this regard, which initially does not require such exceptionally accurate mutual pointing of the transmitter antennas and the receiver onto each other. An additional significant practical limitation is the very high sensitivity of the efficiency of optical laser communication to current atmospheric conditions along the path of propagation of the laser beam. Significant cloudiness, intense precipitation, or other adverse meteorological phenomena can significantly weaken or completely interrupt the effective transmission of such an optical signal, which makes optical communication a much less universal, resistant to various weather conditions technology compared to traditional radio communication, which is much more noise resistant in this regard. That is why modern military aviation views the promising technology of optical laser communication primarily as a valuable addition to existing, much more mature traditional radio communication methods, used primarily in certain specific tactical situations, where the special importance of maximum secrecy and security of transmitted information justifies the additional technical difficulties associated with the use of such technology and certain operational limitations, and not at all as a complete, widespread replacement for a much more universal and technically much more mature traditional radio communication. Military aviation is an incredibly complex, multifaceted system where engineering, human experience, historical memory and the constant, never-ending search for new solutions have been inextricably intertwined throughout the more than century-long history of military aviation. As such,